As for his face, it was so nearly the embodiment of the descriptions of heroes in Miranda's favorite books that she was awed. Here were the full, flexible mouth, the aquiline nose with slightly flaring nostrils, the high and noble forehead accented by stern black brows. There was only one discrepancy. Heroes invariably had dark eyes, large and flashing, but Nicholas's eyes were not large, and they were blue, evidence of his Dutch ancestry. A peculiarly vivid light blue that was startling and somehow disconcerting in a face that might otherwise have belonged to a Spanish grandee. When they were settled in the sitting-room, which was even more luxurious than their own, Nicholas said, "I beg your pardon for not being here to greet you, but the Swallow has only just now docked. I trust you've been comfortable?" "Oh, to be sure, Mr. Van Ryn," cried Miranda, so carried away with gratitude that she interrupted her father. "Everything's wonderful and grand." Nicholas noted the faint provincialism in her clear voice, and he turned and looked at her swiftly, the briefest glance, but it missed nothing. The tall grace of her slim body under the clumsy clothes, the delicate face with its unrealized potentialities for real beauty, the long hazel eyes, innocent of any emotion but excitement, and a transparent admiration for himself. "She shows her blood," he thought with satisfaction. "Thank fortune she's not a hulking farm girl." He had had misgivings about the invitation after it had been sent. Strangers were not lightly introduced at Dragonwyck, and despite the relationship, which was the only reason he had acceded to his wife's request for a companion to the child, he would have suavely packed Miranda back to Greenwich had he thought her impossible. "You're a powerful sight younger than I thought for," exclaimed Ephraim suddenly. He had been examining Nicholas, and his conclusions, though based on the same evidence, were different from his daughter's. Nicholas laughed. "I'm 31. "Well, ye don't look it," answered Ephraim doubtfully. This fellow had the kind of slimsy looks that might turn a silly girl's head, and he certainly didn't have the feel of a good, solid family man. Was it proper to let the lass go off with him tomorrow on a day-long trip? And what was this dumb-fool business he'd let the women talk him into anyway, thought Ephraim, with a spurt of baffled irritation. This irritation and its cause were obvious to Nicholas, who could usually read people's minds when he troubled to do so. He was completely indifferent to anyone's opinion, and the viewpoint of a New England farmer interested him not at all. But this man was his guest, and the father of his kinswoman. It therefore amused him to charm Ephraim out of his doubts. So he talked a while of Johanna, his wife, and little Katrina, stressing the pleasure they anticipated from Miranda's arrival. Then he flattered Ephraim by asking his opinion on politics, and listened with intent interest to the answers. Even when Ephraim outlined the religious observances which he would expect from Miranda, and tried to exact a promise that she would be kept up to the mark, Nicholas remained smoothly gracious and reassuring, though he committed himself to nothing. As it never occurred to Ephraim that there could be a respectable family which did not hold morning and evening prayer, and attend church twice on Sundays, the real, though unrecognized obstacle to Miranda's departure on the morrow was averted. For Nicholas was a hedonist and an atheist, and Ephraim would have regarded him with greater horror than he would a leper had he known. But he did not know, and by the evening, after they had supped, he had come to feel that Van Ryn was pleasant and solid enough after all. They disagreed once. In speaking again of the elections, Nicholas said casually, "My farmers will of course vote for Van Buren, unless this unknown Polk should get nominated. In that event I shall decide what would be best for them to do." Ephraim sat up with a jerk. "Your farmers? What in tunket do you mean by that?" "Why, my tenant farmers on the manor land," answered Nicholas. There are nearly 200 of them." "Don't they own their own land?" asked Ephraim, frowning. Miranda, who had sat quietly in a corner unnoticed by either man during the lengthy conversation, which did not interest her, turned her head from the window where she had been entranced by the coming of evening to New York and the myriad lights that leapt from the windows. She saw Nicholas' eyebrows raise and an expression of annoyance on his face. "Of course they don't own the land," he said. "It belongs to me, as it did to my father before me, and straight back to Cornelius Van Ryn, the first Patroon, who took the title in 1630. The tenants pay a very small yearly rent, and in return we have done a great deal for them." "How much land have you altogether?" pursued Ephraim. "Only a few thousand acres. My grant is not nearly so large as that of the Van Rensselaers or the Livingstons." "Can the farmers not buy the land they've been working if they have a mind to?" Ephraim was still mulling over this new problem. "No," said Nicholas curtly. And Miranda saw, as her father did not, that behind his polite expression Nicholas was displeased. She saw no reason for it. All this talk of land and tenantry conveyed nothing to her. She had no means of knowing that Nicholas, who preferred to forget the matter, had of late had unpleasant evidence of unrest amongst his tenants. He refused to believe that the richly productive and gratifying feudal system, which had supported himself and his ancestors for 200 years, could ever be seriously threatened. He treated his farmers with aristocratic indulgence, built them schools and chapels and bridges, bought them new machinery, entertained them with feastings, settled their differences, and kept a disciplinary eye on their lives. In return, he expected them to be grateful and loyal as they always had been, and to share with him a just proportion of their produce. "I would rather," said Ephraim suddenly, "own 1/2 acre of barren, stony land myself, free and clear, than work the richest farm in the country for someone else." "Then you're very foolish," said Nicholas sharply, but controlled himself at once. "I dare say it's just that we don't understand each other's viewpoint. This must be very dull for you," he added, getting up and walking over to Miranda. "I don't know what it's all about," she confessed, "but I'm happy looking out of the window. The park looks so pretty and cool, with all the lights and that fountain. What's the big building, Mr. Van Ryn?" She pointed. "And that one?" "You mustn't call me Mr. Van Ryn, Miranda. Call me Cousin Nicholas," he said, smiling. He stood close behind her, and a warm, delightful sensation came to her as they looked out onto Broadway. "That's the City Hall," he answered her question, "and that building across the street is the Park Theater." "Oh," she breathed, "how dearly I'd love to see a play." "Ranny!" exclaimed her father angrily. "She knows better than that, Mr. Van Ryn. I can't think why she often talks so wildly." Miranda flushed and lowered her lids, but not before she had seen the amusement on Nicholas's face. Was it for her, or her father, or what? She thought unhappily. She couldn't bear it if he were laughing at her, because already she wanted desperately to please him. Of course, he was really quite old, and married for so long. But someone like him, only younger and with dark, flashing eyes, would fit perfectly into that daydream where souls commingled as they had for the lovely Esmeralda. Chapter 3. Miranda slept little that night. Everything was strange. The street-lights that filtered through her tightly drawn curtains, the amazing softness of the bed, the absence of a bedfellow. It was the first time in her life that Miranda had slept alone, and she would have missed Tibby's breathing and restless little mutters, except that there was so much unaccustomed noise. There was the ticking of an onyx clock on the mantel, the rattle of wagons over the cobblestones, the hourly peal of bells from St. Paul's Church next door, and there was the voice of the watch on the street below.
It's 1 o'clock of a fine summer's night. All's well in the 3rd Ward."
And later, as dawn was breaking, the watch, as though inspired by near release from his duties, became more eloquent.
"It's Tuesday of a June morning, 4 o'clock, and all is well. John Tyler's still our president. The weather's fine, bless the Lord."
By 5 o'clock, Miranda gave it up. She had been dressed and at the window for an hour when the waiters appeared in the sitting-room with breakfast. She was too excited to eat much, and when Nicholas appeared, smiling and courteous, telling her that his barouche was waiting at the door, she suppressed a belated instinct to cling to her father. Ephraim had no stomach for sentiment this morning. The girl was going, and he was impatient to get back home. He also had slept badly, and he was not of those who enjoy a break in routine. So their farewells were hurriedly said on the steps before the Astor house.
"God in his providence will guard you, Miranda. Remember always that you're the Lord's handmaiden. Serve him diligently," said Ephraim, putting his round beaver hat firmly on his head. "And farewell to you, sir." He turned to Nicholas, who stood beside them, his uncovered dark hair slightly ruffled by the morning breeze. "Chastise her when she needs it. I pray that you'll make her useful to you and your wife. She's inclined to be lazy, I'm warning you. See that she writes home often, and don't let her neglect her prayers."
Miranda flushed, and Nicholas bowed gravely, saying, "I will treat her in every way as though she were my own daughter." "But I couldn't be," thought Miranda. "He's but 13 years older than I." And this sudden thought startled her.
"Good-bye to you, then," said Ephraim.
He picked up his straw basket and walked rapidly away down Broadway. At once a sensation of forlornness seized Miranda. He might have kissed her, she thought, aware that this was folly. Ephraim did not hold with cousining and cuddling. And he's not very fond of me anyway, she thought wistfully. She knew that Ephraim was, so to say, through with her for the present. He had done his duty, albeit unwillingly, had turned her over to her new cousin, and was anxious to get back to his real interests. She sighed as Nicholas handed her into the barouche. As they rode west on Berkeley Street, she was too despondent to notice her surroundings. She had never been in a private carriage before, but even the liveried coachman on the box and the 2 sleek bay horses did not capture her attention. She vaguely supposed them to be hired, having no conception of the way men of Nicholas' standing lived. He kept a full stable and 2 carriages in New York for use during his infrequent visits, and he had recently built himself a townhouse on Stuyvesant Place for the same purpose. The house had been closed, its furniture swathed in dust sheets, and it had not seemed worth while to have it opened for one night, hence his choice of an hotel. But when they reached the Hudson River pier, and Miranda saw the enormous white and gold steamboat which awaited them, she was startled out of her depression. "Oh, do we sail on that?" she cried. "I never saw a boat so big and beautiful." Nicholas smiled. Her naivete amused him. It would be interesting to form this immature mind, to teach it and mold it. She would have much to learn before she would do him credit as his cousin. Those hideous clothes must be rectified. She must lose the flat drawl that proclaimed her Yankee upbringing. He had noticed her uncertainty with forks and knives. Her table manners in general needed correction. She must learn how to walk with dignity instead of apologetically. She was unpoised. Her movements were jerky. She seemed not to realize that she must always precede a gentleman, and hung back in an awkward way whenever he tried to usher her through a door. But she would learn easily. Fortunately, nature had given her delicate bones and a graceful slenderness, very different from Johanna. As always, at the thought of his wife, a black curtain descended in his mind. They reached the gangplank, an ornate affair of mahogany and red plush carpeting. Miranda stopped uncertainly at its foot, instinctively waiting for Nicholas to lead the way. He shook his head. You must go first. Always a lady precedes her escort."
"Oh, to be sure," she said quickly. Pa had always led his flock, but this was different, the ways of the gentry. She would not make that mistake again. The Swallow was overpowering to Miranda. It was, as the newspapers proudly called it, a floating palace. From the carved golden eagle on the bow to the gaily flying flag at the stern, every available surface had been embellished with scrollwork painted white and tastefully accented with gilt. Inside the main saloon, 2 decks high, Corinthian pillars supported Gothic arches, which merged in turn into a vast ceiling painted with cupids and garlands. The satin draperies, the inch-thick carpets, the enormous chandeliers eclipsed even those at the Astor House. Whereas yesterday Miranda had sat on a sack of potatoes in the market boat, today she had a rose-wooden velvet armchair in a sheltered recess of the broad white deck. And there was music. A German band in the saloon rendered one after another, without interval, the popular tunes. They gathered speed after they passed Yonkers, and Miranda was grateful for the protected place which Nicholas had found, for the firemen brought up pressure by the addition of fat pine knots to the anthracite, and less sheltered passengers must either be deluged with soot and flying sparks or seek the stuffy saloon. The Swallow was leaving the Newburgh landing when several passengers ran down the decks to the stern, and the boat seemed to leap forward. The pistons banged to a new frenzied rhythm, and sparks flew thick as red flies from the stacks. Nicholas stood up and gazed downriver, where another ship had appeared around the jut of Denning's Point. "It's the Express," he said. "She's after us. Now we shall doubtless race her to Poughkeepsie." "Race?" questioned Miranda, surprised. "Whatever for?" "For the pleasure of proving that the other boat is inferior." She looked at him quickly, thinking it an odd reply, and wondering if he were laughing at her. But he was intently watching the Express's progress as she gained on them. The Swallow's pounding and straining increased until it seemed that her decks would burst open, and the sparks from the smokestack coalesced into tongues of actual flame. Suddenly the race frightened her. "Isn't it dangerous?" she cried as the deck grew hot under her thin soles. Nicholas shrugged, never taking his eyes from the pursuing boat, whose bow was now flush with their stern. "There's danger everywhere, I suppose." She shrank into her seat, clutching its arms and telling herself that she must not be a silly coward. Certainly everyone else was enjoying himself hugely. The passengers surged from bow to stern, cheering or groaning as now one boat gained and then the other. They made hoarse wagers on the outcome, shouting across the 100 yards of water to the Express, whose own passengers and crew answered back in kind. And then it was all over. The Swallow slid first up to her Poughkeepsie dock. There was deafening applause on the decks around them, while catcalls and oaths came from the vanquished boat. Miranda felt foolish, and glancing apologetically at Nicholas, she saw that though he had taken no part in the enthusiasm of the passengers, he yet wore an expression of exhilaration and triumph, an expression which vanished at once as his face returned to its usual reserve. She had a moment of puzzled uneasiness, for though she did not in the least understand him, she knew that his reaction to the race was not like that of the other passengers. She felt that the contest had had for him an inner meaning, and that in some ways its outcome represented the vindication of his will. The Swallow proceeded decorously upriver from Poughkeepsie, but Miranda continued to suffer uneasiness out of all proportion to the cause. This uneasiness had in it a quality of foreboding and of prescience, as though the boisterous and senseless contest between two boats held for her a future significance. And yet the summer afternoon was tranquilly blue, and the narrowing river flowed peacefully past their vessel as the wooded shores came nearer. By the time that the western shore reared itself up into the purple masses of the Catskills, she had regained her eager expectancy and cried, "Oh, Cousin Nicholas, how high they are! I no notion mountains were so big."
Nicholas thought of the Alps, in which he had spent the summer of 1835 while making the grand tour before his marriage, and he smiled, but forbore to disillusion her. Instead, he pointed out the mountain house, whose 13 white columns were visible even at that distance. "That's Rip Van Winkle's country, back of the mountain house," said Nicholas. "They say that on hot summer days one can still hear the little men playing at ninepins." Miranda looked blank. "Don't you know Dietrich Knickerbocker and the sketchbook?" She shook her head. "Tales by Washington Irving, a fine writer and a friend of mine," Nicholas explained. "No doubt you'll meet him some day." Nicholas settled back in his chair. This touched on one of his dominant interests. He was well grounded in the classics, of course, though it had never occurred to his father to send him to college. That type of education, open to almost anyone, even tradesmen and farmers' sons, was not fitting to an aristocrat. There had therefore been a succession of tutors, German and English, to prepare the boy for the cultural climax of the grand tour. He had spent 2 years traveling elegantly through England, France, Spain, Italy, and Germany, before returning to Dragonwyck to find that his father had died, and he was now lord of the manor. Nicholas then knew the classics, but in the last 5 years he had developed a lively interest in contemporary American writing. In this he differed from most of the young men of his class, who aped the European and persisted in regarding the United States as crude and negligible. Nicholas, true to his birth, and an upbringing far less democratic than that of an English nobleman, delighted in the role of Patroon. He had patterned himself half-consciously on a Lorenzo de' Medici or a Prince Esterhazy. He enjoyed entertaining the intelligentsia at Dragonwyck. He read the new works of Bryant, Hawthorne, and a startling young writer called Poe, with a sincere appreciation which was only slightly patronizing. For Nicholas's conviction of his own superiority was so interwoven with his flesh and bone that he had no need to prove it to others, as do those not quite secure. He was a Van Ryn of Dragonwick Manor, a law unto himself and beholden to nobody in earth, or in heaven. He glanced again at Miranda, who sat forward, gazing first at one shore, then the other. The breeze had whipped color into her white skin. Her lips were slightly parted, her small breasts under the brown merino bodice rose and fell rapidly. There was a strong aura of femininity about her, and her long eyes, gold-flecked in green between thick dark lashes, were really magnificent. Except that they were innocent of all sex consciousness, they were the seductive eyes of a passionate woman. "In half an hour we'll arrive at Dragonwyck, Miranda. This town is Hudson." She obediently inspected the small, neat collection of buildings and wharfs, but she was somewhat sated with new sights, and privately thought Newburgh or Poughkeepsie more attractive. "I've wondered about the name Dragonwyck, Cousin Nicholas," she said timidly. "Please don't think me prying," she added, fearful that she might offend him again. But Nicholas was pleased to explain anything that bore on the history of his family or manor. He sat down at once. "The name is typical of the place, in that it's a mixture of Indian legend and Dutch now anglicized, made into English," he added, seeing that she did not understand the word. "You see, when my direct ancestor, Cornelius Van Ryn, the first Patroon, acquired our lands here, he sailed up from New Amsterdam to inspect them, and chose the site for the manor house. He decided on this cliff by the river. But there was a party of Mohican Indians camped nearby, and he soon found that they were afraid of this cliff on which he had started to build his house. They avoided it always, and though he was kind to them, they feared him too, nor would they touch one stone or brick which went into the building. After he knew them better, he discovered the reason. They believed that under the cliff there lived a great winged serpent which devoured everything which encroached on its territory.
"And did he build there anyway?" asked Miranda. "Of course he did. And he called the place Dragonwyck, Place of the Dragon in Dutch, and so it has been for 200 years. "The dragon hasn't ever bothered you?" asked Miranda, half seriously. Nicholas was amused at her question. "No. There are many other legends and superstitions of this region. I hope you're not too impressionable, or old Zélie will frighten you with her spook rocks and phantom ships and witches." He stopped abruptly, as though he had been going to add something else. She waited politely to see if he would go on, but he did not, and just then the steamer gave one sharp blast and veered to the eastern bank. "We're here," he said. She turned from her puzzled contemplation of his face. In after years, Miranda knew that her first sight of Dragonwyck was the most vivid and significant impression of her life. She stared at the fantastic silhouette which loomed dark against the eastern sky, the spires and gables and chimneys dominated in the center by one high tower. And it was as though the good and evil, the happiness and tragedy, which she was to experience under that roof, materialized into physical force and struck across the quiet river into her soul.
While the steamer made fast to the private landing, she stood by the rail close to Nicholas, gazing up at his house with a fascinated repulsion, while the setting sun touched half the 100 windows into fiery rectangles against the blackness of the vine-covered stone.
Nicholas, seeing her awe-struck face, was content to let her gaze in silence. His home was part of him, an externalized expression of his will, for upon his inherited Dutch manor house he had superimposed the gothic magnificence which he desired. He had been attracted by the formulations of Andrew Downing, the young landscape architect who lived on the river at Newburgh, and whose directions for building romantic and picturesque villas were changing the countryside. But it was not in Nicholas to accept another's ideas, and when 5 years ago he had remodeled the old Van Ryn homestead, he had used Downing simply as a guide. To the original 10 rooms he had added 20 more, the gables and turrets, and the one high tower. The result, though reminiscent of a German Schloss on the Rhine, crossed with Tudor English and interwoven with pure fantasy, was nevertheless Hudson River American, and not unsuited to its setting.
The Dragonwick Gardens were as much an expression of Nicholas's personality as was the mansion, for here he had subdued nature to a stylized ornateness.
Between the untouched grove of hemlocks to the south and the slope of a rocky hill half a mile to the north, he had created along the river an artificial and exotic beauty. To Miranda it was overpowering, and she felt dazed as they mounted marble steps from the landing. She was but vaguely conscious of the rose gardens and their pervasive scent, of small Greek temples set beneath weeping willows, of rock pavilions, violet-bordered fountains, and waterfalls. She was acutely conscious of her travel-stained brown dress, and the sharp, contemptuous stare of the liveried footman who had met them on the pier and was gingerly carrying her wicker basket. It wasn't credible that she was to live in a place like this, and her steps as she followed Nicholas to the great front door dragged slower and slower even as her heart beat faster. They entered the great hall which ran 60 feet through the house to open on the back lawns by the drive. It was dark inside, for the tapers had not yet been lit, and she shrank towards Nicholas as 2 people glided through a door at the right and confronted them, bowing. They were Magda, Mrs. Van Ryn's housekeeper and personal maid, and Tompkins, the butler. They both ignored Miranda while they greeted their master, but from the woman's thick back and round averted head, Miranda felt hostility. "Where is Mrs. Van Ryn?" asked Nicholas, allowing the butler to take his cape and hat. "In green drawing-room, my lord." The butler was a Yorkshireman who had accompanied Nicholas back from England years ago,
and with the special snobbery of the British servant, had always addressed his master by this title, insisting that in any civilized country the owner of such lands and name and estate would have been a peer. Nicholas, agreeing with him, had not objected, though the matter was indifferent to him. A Van Ryn had no need of title or distinction borrowed from Europe. "This way, then, Miranda," said Nicholas, ushering her down the hall to a doorway on the left. "You shall now have the pleasure of meeting my wife." Was there a peculiar intonation in his voice, or did she imagine it? She had no time to wonder, for they entered the green drawing-room. Johanna Van Ryn sat by the window embroidering. She started, and her gold thimble rattled on the floor as Miranda and Nicholas walked in. She looked up at her husband, and the dull, colourless eyes came to life with longing and mute appeal. "You're back," she whispered. Nicholas picked up the thimble and placed it on the taboret beside a half-eaten cruller. He bowed to his wife, and taking her extended hand, which was loaded with rings, barely touched it with his lips. "Yes, I'm back, as you see. And here is Miranda." Johanna's eyes dropped, and she gave a nearly inaudible sigh. "Welcome to Dragonwyck, child," she said, not looking at the girl. "I trust you'll be happy. Nicholas, did you bring me the pastries?" Miranda stared at the figure in the rocking-chair. Johanna was enormously fat, the plump, pale fat that makes monstrous dimples at elbows and knuckles. On her face, which was round and white as one of those crockery plates in the kitchen at home, there were two unskilfully applied spots of what even Miranda, who had never seen any, recognized as rouge. The scanty flaxen hair was tightly drawn back and covered with a coquettish lace cap, embellished with blue ribbons none too fresh. There were delicate laces covering her bosom, and on them were scattered small brown crumbs, whose origin was no further to seek than the cruller on the taboret. Miranda, suddenly remembering her manners, said, "It's most kind of you, ma'am, to let me come here. Please to accept Ma and Pa's respects." Johanna nodded. "I'm sure they're most worthy people, and I'm sure you'll be a good girl. Nicholas, did you get those pastries?" Her husband stood looking down at her a moment without answering. Then he spoke pleasantly. "I did, my dear. Will you have them here now, or can you wait until supper time?" "Did you get the Napoleons, the honey puffs, and the mocha bonbons?" "All of them." She contracted her tow-colored eyebrows. "Well, I think I'll have the bonbons now. Tell Tompkins to have the others served at dinner. Be sure he keeps them well chilled so the cream won't melt." Nicholas bowed slightly. "It shall be done, my love." "How sweet he is to her," thought Miranda. "I suppose he was awfully in love with her and hasn't noticed that she's so fat and untidy." Farther than that she did not go in her thoughts, for she was determined to like Johanna. "One of the servants will show you to your room," said Johanna, at last realizing that the girl was still standing there. "And after a while you'd best go and find Katrina. I never can keep track of that child. You might read a story to her." "I think we can hardly ask our guest to occupy herself with a child tonight," said Nicholas. "She must be tired." Johanna shrugged her massive shoulders, and thrusting out an incredibly small foot in a purple velvet slipper, began to rock slowly back and forth. "Oh, to be sure, you must rest if you're tired, my dear. You'll feel better after a good supper. You may eat in the nursery." "Oh, I think not," said Nicholas again. "Our cousin would hardly eat in the nursery. It will be a pleasure to have her with us." Johanna pursed her mouth. "As you like, Nicholas. Only do hurry and tell Tompkins about those pastries, or they'll be quite ruined." Miranda listened to all this with dismay. She didn't know what a nursery was exactly, but it was plain enough that Johanna expected to consider her as a kind of upper servant. She was correspondingly grateful to Nicholas for his attitude, but neither this nor the luxurious magnificence of the bedroom in which she presently found herself obliterated a spasm of homesickness and a yearning to return to the dearly familiar and simple farmhouse. It seemed a week since she had bade her father good-bye that morning, and a month at least since she had seen Abigail's shrewd, affectionate face. She threw herself on the bed and indulged in bitter tears, which were not quenched by the realization that she had wanted to come to Dragonwyck, and here she was, that she had yearned for luxury and elegance, and now she had it to an extent 1,000 times beyond her dreams. She felt defenseless and out of place, frightened by the servants, unable to like Johanna, appalled by the size and grandeur of the house, which she had barely glimpsed as Nicholas led her upstairs. Nor did she altogether like Nicholas. He gave her a strange sensation that was half pleasurable and half a shrinking discomfort. "I wish I hadn't come," she thought, and in the thinking knew that it wasn't true. She had been impelled toward Dragonwyck from the very first moment of hearing about it, and now that she was here, it still seemed to be pulling her closer, as though there were a magnet hidden in its grey stone turrets. She sat up and dried her eyes and looked around the room. The bedroom at the Astor house had been only a pallid introduction to this. Her 3 windows faced south and commanded the whole sweep of the river downstream, while in the distance rose the Catskills, hazy in the dusk. She was on the 2nd floor, on which there were 6 large bedchambers, as she later discovered, and hers the middle one on the south side. It was furnished with massive black walnut pieces in the Gothic style, and its draperies were of peacock blue brocade, as was the tester of the 4-posted bed. The rug was an aubusson, specially woven for the room in a pattern of golden wheat sheaves garlanded with blue and green. The wash-bowl and ewer, even the doorknobs, were made of engraved silver. Miranda's youth and her temperament combined to raise her spirits, and to her other discoveries was now added an excited wonder. Imagine a bathroom across the hall with a silver tub. Imagine, above all, the small private closet which opened from her room and was obviously for her exclusive use. She thought of the embarrassing and chilly trips across the yard to the outhouse behind the bushes at home, and felt for them all there an impatient pity. How little they knew of real refinement. They hadn't even sense enough to want a different way of living. Except Ma, she thought with swift love. How dearly I'd like to have her here, too. She unpacked the wicker basket and hung her 3 calico dresses in the painted Dutch casse, where they looked lost and bedraggled. She longed to change the brown merino, which now seemed to her incredibly ugly, but there was nothing to change into. The calicos would be worse. Supper was a silent meal. The food, served by Tompkins and a young footman, was delicious, but Miranda had no appetite. The profusion of strangely shaped spoons and forks dismayed her, and so did the wine-glasses which stood beside her plate. From one of these she took a sip because the Van Ryns did, feeling very defiant and wicked as she thought of her father, but the stuff tasted sour, and she pushed the glass stealthily away. Nicholas, at the head of the table, scarcely spoke except to make conventional inquiry as to her comfort. It seemed impossible that he could have been the entertaining companion of the first part of today's journey. As for Johanna, she concentrated on her food, and her only remarks had to do with that subject. The roast was overdone, but the potato cakes were tolerable. Annette must remember not to get the jellies so hard. When she had mopped up the last bit of honey puff, Johanna looked up at Miranda. "Where's Katharina?" she asked. "I don't know, ma'am. I'm sorry. I've not seen her yet," answered the girl nervously, wondering if she had already failed in a duty. Johanna frowned. "That child. She's always down with the servants. Now that you're here, I hope you can keep her upstairs where she belongs.
That's why I wanted a companion for her. I'll try hard, ma'am."
Johanna gave Miranda a dissatisfied look. "You're not quite the type I expected, but I suppose you'll do your best. You seem very sweet," she added with a vague smile and a quick glance at Nicholas, who was peeling himself a nectarine and had not looked up. Johanna heaved herself up from her chair and waddled on her tiny feet into the adjoining room. "Send Miss Katrina in to us, Tompkins," ordered Nicholas, rising and motioning Miranda to follow his wife, who had already ensconced herself in an armed rocker by the central table. This was one of the many rooms that Miranda had not yet seen. It was called the Red Room, from the color of its carpet and plush curtains, and it was comparatively small because it was part of the original house, and Nicholas had left it alone. Around its fireplace ran still the old blue-and-white Dutch tiles, representing the story of Adam and Eve and the fall, and the furniture was simple for Dragonwyck. Besides the center table with its fringed red velvet cover, there were only 3 chairs, a horsehair sofa, and in the corner an old and shabby harpsichord. At first Miranda decided that it was more homelike and cozy than the rest of the house. She sat timidly in the corner by the harpsichord. Johanna rocked while jabbing with a clumsy hand at the white lawn handkerchief she was embroidering. Nicholas, with his back to the unlit fire, buried himself in the Morning Tribune, which he had brought from New York. 10 candles lit the room, and in their soft light the reflected reds glowed warmly. It was a reassuring domestic scene. But as she sat there, an indefinable discomfort crept over Miranda, and at the same time she shivered from a sudden sensation of cold. "Dare I ask them to light the fire?" she thought, and knew that she did not. The June night was warm, and she could see Johanna's forehead and upper lip glistening. Miranda shifted uneasily in her seat, and the formless discomfort mounted within her until between one second and the next it ceased to be discomfort, and she knew it for blind, unreasoning fear. Fear of what? She moistened her lips and looked about her. There was nothing but the comfortable room. Nicholas turned a page of his newspaper, and the small rustle mingled with the rhythmic creak of his wife's rocker. Both these sounds seemed to Miranda to come from a vast and chilly distance. She clasped and unclasped her hands, struggling with a violent urge to run headlong from the room. The door opened, and a little girl walked in, dragging her feet. At once the fear and the feeling of cold vanished. "Oh, there you are, pet," said Johanna vaguely. "You're a naughty girl to stay away so much." Nicholas took the child's arm and led her over to Miranda. "This is your new cousin, Katrina." The child put her finger in her mouth and gaped at Miranda, who smiled and held her hand out. Katrina would some day be a replica of her mother. She was a plump and stolid child now, with the same scanty tow-colored hair and small, colorless eyes like pebbles. "Shake hands with your cousin," said Nicholas sharply, and Katrina slowly obeyed. "We'll be friends, won't we, dear?" said Miranda, trying to draw the child toward her, but the chunky little body resisted. "Yes, Cousin Miranda," answered Katrina without interest. "Can I go find my kitty now, Mama?" she added, scuffling her slippers and twisting a corner of her plaid skirt. "Oh, I suppose so," began Johanna fretfully, but the child did not wait for more. She gave her father a quick, apprehensive glance, and seeing that he was not going to stop her, she darted from the room, away from the mother who was always discontented and ineffectual, and the father who frightened her, back to the simple delights of the kitchen and Annette's welcoming presence.
Nicholas's eyes followed his daughter, and Miranda saw that the dull, unprepossessing child was a disappointment to him, though how bitter a one to a man of his nature she could not guess.
Johanna sighed and bent over the monogram she was embroidering. Nicholas's monogram, Miranda now saw, and saw also that the letters were botched and straggling. "I can't think," said Johanna, "why Trina's always wanting to run to the servants. She can't get those tastes from my side, or yours either, Nicholas, except possibly the Gan savants, for they were certainly common people." Miranda looked up, startled. Johanna must be aware that she was insulting her guest, whose only connection with the Van Ryns was through these same Gan savants, but one look reassured her. Johanna was simply following a familiar train of thought, and was perfectly insensitive to any overtones or ramifications which it might develop. "No one could possibly doubt that your ancestry is of the bluest and most aristocratic, my love."
And again Miranda was struck by the extraordinary sweetness of Nicholas's tone.
Johanna smiled. "My papa," she said to Miranda, "always used to say that he despaired of finding a suitable match for his girls in view of the sad way the country had gone lately. There are so few of the fine river families left. But he was pleased when I married Nicholas. He thought that a Van Ryn would do very well, though he would perhaps have preferred a Livingston or a Van Rensselaer." "I'm profoundly grateful that he found me acceptable," said Nicholas. "Miranda, do you play the pianoforte? We might have some music." She shook her head. "I'm sorry." "Well, anyway, come and turn the pages for me." She looked at the harpsichord, but Nicholas shook his head. "No one ever touches that old instrument. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Azilde de la Corbeille." "I wish you'd get rid of the thing, Nicholas," said Johanna suddenly, putting down her work. "It's not in keeping with the rest of the furniture, and then there's that old story. I vow the servants are afraid to dust it." "Servants are always superstitious," answered Nicholas indifferently. "You know very well that I never get rid of anything that belonged to my ancestors. Their material possessions are as precious to me as the blood and traditions which I also inherited. Come, Miranda, let's go to the music-room. You don't care to come, I suppose, my love, since you never do?" Johanna bent her fat neck and stared down at the embroidery. "Isn't it rather late? Miranda must be tired. You said yourself she was tired." "I'm not tired now," said the girl quickly, with some resentment, for why should she be sent to bed like a child when Nicholas had paid her the compliment of wishing her company? Besides, there was an undercurrent here that she did not understand. Without further words, Nicholas led the way to the music-room, a nearly empty chamber with a vaulted ceiling and an oriel window beneath which stood the pianoforte. As they entered the room, a figure slid out from the shadowy hall and lit the tapers. Miranda soon grew accustomed to the noiseless and almost invisible service at Dragonwyck, though it took her some time to realize that it was part of Nicholas's plan of aesthetic living. The machinery of labor must never intrude. The synthetic perfection of his surroundings must seem to spring effortlessly into being, as from the touch of an enchanter's wand. For this reason, the pleasure gardens, even the lawns and fruit orchards, were always romantically deserted. The necessary digging, weeding, hoeing, and trimming was done at night by an army of gardeners with lanterns and torches. Nicholas sat down on the piano-stool, and it soon developed that she could not possibly turn the pages, for though she read the soprano part of hymns, she could not follow the complicated sonatas which suited his mood that evening. He was a musician of distinction. He played with passion and a fastidious brilliance. These qualities she felt, though the cascades of sound meant nothing to her uneducated ear. She watched his flexible hands and his profile against the green curtain behind the piano. His eyes were fixed on the distance, a point far beyond the instrument, and she knew he had forgotten all about her. But she felt again at ease with him. He executed a chromatic run and stopped. "That was Beethoven, Miranda." He turned, and giving her an understanding look, smiled at her. "But here's something you will like, I think. He drew a sheet of music out of the carved chest beside the piano. "This is something new from England, an opera called The Bohemian Girl. I'll play the air through once, and then you sing it. Oh, yes, you can. It's very easy." So Miranda stood beside him and sang, "I dreamt that I dwelt in marble halls." And when her first self-consciousness wore off, she thrilled to the singular appropriateness of the words. Had he guessed her dreams, and was that why he had picked this music? But the song was about love as well, and her voice wavered as she thought, "Love there can never be for me in these marble halls. This then is not my dream. How could it be?" The song ended, and Nicholas raised his head. Their eyes met for a second, and a faint color flowed under her white skin. "You have a pretty voice," he said softly, "and you sing with feeling. Is there perhaps someone at home whom you've promised to love just the same?" She shook her head and turned away, gripped by an obscure unhappiness. Nicholas nodded, satisfied. It would be a pity to educate Miranda from a farm girl into a lady, only to have her go back to some yokel on whom everything would be wasted. "I must try to find her a worthy husband," he thought. And rising abruptly, he closed the piano. "Good night, Miranda." "What have I done now?" she thought, "that he should dismiss me so sharply?" She murmured something, confused because he stood motionless beside the piano, waiting for her to precede him from the room. "Pay your respects to Mrs. Van Ryn, and then you may retire," he said, seeing her uncertainty. In the red room, Johanna still sat, but the embroidery had disappeared. She was engaged in sipping port wine and munching sugar biscuits. "How greedy she is," thought the girl with distaste, while she politely said good night. Johanna responded amiably, smiling her indeterminate smile, but her pale eyes slid from Miranda's face to seek those of her husband. He, however, had his back turned to both women, while he rifled the pages of a new copy of Graham's magazine, which had been lying on the table. He bowed as Miranda left them, then returned to his magazine. To her mortification, Miranda could not find her way back to her own room. She took the wrong turn in the great hall and missed the staircase which led up through an archway. She wandered through a maze of dark rooms until she encountered the silent young footman who had lit the candles. "This way, miss," he said tonelessly, and directed her up the stairs to her own door. She noted with amazement all the things which had been performed by the invisible hands in her absence. The sheet turned down on the bed, the coverlet neatly folded, candles lit long ago, judging by the length that had burned. Her basket had disappeared, and her poor little toilet articles were laid out upon the dresser, where they looked lost and unappetizing on the brocaded scarf. There was hot water steaming in a copper can, and fresh lavender-scented towels, and a silver pitcher of drinking water placed beside some luscious peaches on the table by her bed. Peaches in June! But she was long past amazement. A delicious sensation of comfort lapped around her, enfolding her as softly as did the immense bed. The sheets were of linen so fine that they felt like silk, and they were also scented, not with lavender, but with rose petals and verbena. Miranda stretched voluptuously, like a little cat. It was warm in the room, and she had a sudden desire to feel the cool silkiness upon her body. Her cotton nightdress seemed hot and coarse. On impulse she took it off, thinking how horrified Tibby would be. She flung her bare arms above her head and gloried in her privacy. No one to tell her to move over, no one to tell her to hurry and go to sleep. No need to get up at 5 and cook and wash. She felt a pang when she thought of her mother and the baby. Still, they'll do all right without me, she thought, and after all I'll be back soon, but not too soon. Not until she had sated herself with the strangeness and the adventure and the delectable savor of the great wealth and luxury, not until... She sat up, clutching the sheets tight around her neck, for there was a sharp tap at the door.
"Who's there?"
she quavered. The door opened, and a strange woman walked in, shutting the door behind her. A thin, old figure in a shapeless black dress who came over to the bed and gazed down at the frightened girl. The woman was nearly 6 feet tall and erect, her coarse black hair, which showed no gray, drawn back into a scraggy knot, her face a ruddy brown crisscrossed with wrinkles from which peered 2 shrewd little eyes as black as dewberries.
"What do you want?" whispered Miranda.
"Me, old Zélie," said the woman in a harsh, accented voice, touching her slab-like chest. "I want to see what you look like." Miranda let her breath out. Cousin Nicholas had mentioned Zélie on the boat, someone who might try to frighten her with tales of spooks and witches. It must be an old servant, a bit touched in the head, no doubt, though the unwinking black eyes looked sane enough. They travelled slowly from the girl's apprehensive face to the masses of golden hair which fell across the bare shoulders and down to the bed. Zélie shook her head. "Pauvre petite." She spoke with a sort of sad resignation. "What for you coming in this house? There will be badness. Isilda will laugh again." "You're talking nonsense," said Miranda. "Please go away. I want to sleep." The shriveled lips parted in a grim smile. "You been in Red Room tonight. I think you feel something? Yes?"
I don't know what you..."
She stopped. Those few seconds of cold and unmeaning fear had certainly been imagination. They had not recurred, and now she doubted that they had happened. "Of course not," she finished angrily. "Do go away." The old woman nodded. "Yes, you feel something, but you not listen. You will rush into trouble with open arms, singing as you go. Maybe it is the will of God." She made a gesture in the air, palm up, and then the sign of the cross.
"Why do you want to frighten me?" cried Miranda, trying to laugh.
"Not to frighten, petite, but warn." Zélie's gnarled hand shot out and closed around a strand of Miranda's hair. The old woman held the bright curl gently, almost tenderly, in her closed hand. She shut her eyes, and over her seamed face there stole a listening look. "You must believe." Her voice rose to a higher note, a sing-song chant. "There is blackness and badness and bloody water around you. There is love too, 2 kinds of love, but you not knowing in time." She opened her eyes, and the strand of hair fell from her hand. "You think old Zélie crazy, eh? You lie there with a naked body and your gold hair like a web, and you not knowing what I mean. Pah! You are a child yet, and your soul is blind, blind as the little mole that burrows beneath the lawn out there, the beautiful, quiet lawn." The black eyes glittered with a contemptuous pity. The gaunt figure turned and walked out of the room, shutting the door behind her.
"She is crazy," whispered Miranda.
She got out of bed and locked the door. It had not occurred to her before, for there were no bedroom locks at the farm. Then she put on her cotton nightdress and braided her hair into tight plaits. She clambered once more into the high bed, but this time she took with her the Bible her father had given her, and which she had forgotten to read earlier. She said her prayers, and then opening the Bible read the 91st Psalm with a passionate and guilty concentration.